Later, artillery bombardment became an on and off affair. The crisis finally subsided toward the end of the year. In Cuba, during the summer of 1958, unrest and ferment gripped the nation. The government survived the rebels' threat of total war and revolutionary strike, but the dictatorship of General Fulgencio Batista leaned heavily on combat-ready guards and armed forces. In July, opposition groups organized outside Cuba to overthrow the government by force, and President Batista could no longer ignore the rebels led by Fidel Castro in the Sierra Maestra Mountains of Oriente province. His elusive forces harassed the government troops and engaged them in heavy fighting during August. These men threatened to kill all candidates in the presidential elections to be held on November 3rd and refused to recognize the new president after the election. Batista fled the country on January 1st, 1959, a day after Castro's forces captured Santa Clara and bisected the island. Havana was plunged into several days of wild demonstrating, rioting, and plundering. The 26th of July movement now came into power. On January 9th, 1959, after a week-long victory march from Santiago, Cuban revolutionary troops made a triumphant entry into Havana, with Fidel Castro established as Cuba's new strongman. This marked the beginning of a regime which has become the first communist foothold in Latin America. The world was to witness his application of revolutionary justice by ordering hundreds of trials and executions and thousands of arrests and long imprisonment. Castro's Cuba moved swiftly into the Soviet orbit. In February 1960, Soviet First Deputy Premier Anastas Mikoyan visited Cuba with Russian credit and other economic agreements. In September 1960, Cuba formally recognized Communist China and North Korea. On January 3rd, 1961, the United States broke diplomatic relations with Cuba. On January 31st, 1962, the Organization of American States excluded Cuba from participation in OAS affairs, declaring the concept of Marxist-Leninism incompatible with the inter-American system. The count is far from complete. We have not mentioned other serious conflicts such as the crisis in Tibet, Laos, and the Congo. And yet, the pattern is obvious. There's not been a single year since World War II that we have not seen some war somewhere. These wars had one thing in common. They were limited. Limited in area, in the weapons used, in the number of belligerents, and most importantly, in their immediate objectives. And another common factor, they involve both the communists and the free world. This post-war era has actually been a period of almost continuous limited war. For we have been living under two basic, historically unique conditions: a deep conflict of aims and interests between communism and the free world, and a terrifying capability of the two main antagonists to destroy each other. And these two conditions breed limited war, piecemeal aggression clashing with local defenses. Challenged by the worldwide offensive of the communists, we have built up collective security. Strengthening the United Nations, joining other free nations to develop the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, the Organization of American States, and other mutual security agreements. And we have steadily improved our military posture. In the words of President Kennedy, although a global nuclear war poses the gravest threat to our survival, it is not the most probable form of conflict as long as we maintain the forces needed to make a nuclear war disastrous to any foe. Military aggression on a lesser scale is far more likely.
We intend to have at all times the capacity to resist non-nuclear or limited attacks as a complement to our nuclear capacity, not as a substitute. We have rejected any all-or-nothing posture which would leave no choice but inglorious retreat or unlimited retaliation.
President Kennedy proposed to further strengthen our conventional forces when he said, "These forces must be equipped and provisioned so they are ready to fight a limited war for a protracted period of time anywhere in the world." The pattern of history clearly reveals that from the flexibility of strength comes the freedom of choice. In the deterrence of war is the preservation of peace.
The Big Picture is an official report for the armed forces and the American people. Produced by the Army Pictorial Center. Presented by the Department of the Army in cooperation with this station.